Okay, I'm just gonna start with the recording. It's a relatively small group here, and I got some questions already in the sheet. So what I'll do is I'll go through those questions. I'll answer them. There has been a workshop that I've already uploaded, which is just about the Netherlands. It's uploaded yesterday on Tuesday, which goes on a lot of things, the economy, culture, all that kind of stuff. So if you want to learn about the Netherlands in a more structured way where you actually have a PowerPoint and I go through a lot of the stuff, then you can watch that one. This one is more of an addendum, so I'm going to be covering a lot of things that people did ask in the forum, but did not get covered in the video. And I'll also do that actually using Paint, because Paint is, of course, the best way to visualize and explain anything. So let's just go through the questions we got. So the first thing that we got as a question was, how's the earning versus cost of living in the Netherlands? And also the question is a bit about how this is in different parts of the Netherlands, and how is this something that you can maybe characterize in the debate. So the cost of living in the Netherlands is, I think, overall doable, but I think it's maybe more expensive than other regions around us. So if you look at, for example, Belgium and Germany, those are nations next to us, they have like cheaper groceries, they have cheaper energy, they have cheaper housing, all that kind of stuff. But we now also still relatively rich, so it's not that we are very, very expensive. I think we're still definitely cheaper than the Scandinavian countries, so like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and all the other like nations more above. I think we're also cheaper than the UK. So if you have a question of like, how are we compared to the rest? I think that's a good explanation of it. Of course, this does also differ in the regions that you are in. If you have seen the video that I did about the Netherlands, then you would know that there is something called the Randstad. And the Randstad is basically this area here. I'm going to make this a bit more big so you can see it more clearly. Yeah, this may be a bit extreme, but you can get it. So it says Rotterdam, The Hague, Amsterdam, Utrecht. In this area, there are a lot of people who live here. Big cities, big service sectors are here. A lot of economic activity, especially in the service sector, is happening in these places. And Rotterdam, of course, also a big port. So there's also a lot of transport that's happening there. Um, so here, the cost of living is, of course, much higher. So housing is more expensive. Buying a beer like on in a bar is more expensive. All of that kind of stuff. So this is comparatively quite expensive. It is not as bad as Dublin or London in a lot of parts, but Amsterdam, for example, is quite expensive. Utrecht is also very wanted as a place to live. So there also housing is quite expensive. So I'm not going to give you like numerics of how much can you buy with the amount of money that you get and the average income, that kind of stuff. I'm just going to give you a bit more of an intuition here of how much money you have in the Netherlands. Most people are doing fine. Most people are able to come by fine. It's not a super duper expensive country, and there are also oftentimes state subsidized alternatives for things if you are poor. So, for example, sport clubs or help for schooling, all that kind of stuff. There are alternatives for people who are maybe as rich. So there's also, of course, state welfare that's happening there. Again, this was just answering one question. If you have a question that is attached to this, you can just unmute and ask yourself or raise your hand. But if not, I'll just go to the meantime. Um, Another question was, how does actually the Dutch school system work? And this is a bit complicated, but I think it is going to be quite clear if I'm going to put this just in drawings. So you have first primary school, and this is up to when you're roughly 12 years. After this, you go to high school, and there are three variations that you can go to. You can go to what's called VWO or VWO. That's this one. This is the one that you'll do that is 6 years. So this is 6 years. So then you're roughly 18 when you're finished here. This is what you need to do as a prerequisite for going to university. So you have university, and university is also independent, but it has to be a 3-year bachelor's, and then after that, a 2 years master's. This is for the people who go to university, so who you see in university debating, but this is not what most people actually go to. Because what you have here is actually an alternative, which is HAVO, and that one is only 5 years. So of course, if you then do some mathematics, which I'm sure all of you can, this means that you'll be roughly 17 years when you finish this. What you do here is you can go two ways. Either you go to VWO and you try to go to university. That's one path. Let me just make this a different color. Or you go to whatever is the higher education for HAVO, which is just called hogere school, or like, I guess like just the next level. Um, Oftentimes this is just 1 year and like, sorry, what one thing that you do, so you don't go for a master's afterwards. And if I'm just going to look at a bit of the time that you have here, it kind of depends, but after HAVO, most of the times, it is still also roughly 3 to 4 years, and oftentimes you can still have maybe after that a bit. So it's also like 3 to 4 years. Depends on the study, depends on how many years you have to take extra and that kind of stuff. And then this is for something like more slightly more applied that you have for your academic stuff. So if you want to do academic physics and you want to do research, you have to go to university. So you have to go via VWO. If you want to become, for example, a high school teacher in physics, or you want to just do a bit more applied, and I don't mean applied in the form of like engineering or technical stuff, because that's also actually just a technical university, but something that's maybe a bit less academically rigorous and a bit more about just application, then you go to this, in Dutch it's just called higher school, which is a very weird, like a very weird translation if you also have high school. But I think that's just the next level of education that you have here. You have oftentimes like a business administration here, some like more things also cater to job markets, whereas here you have more things also for research and that kind of stuff. The majority of people actually do have this level of education. After, and besides that, you also have VMBO, and VMBO is a bit weird for a couple of reasons. One, there's actually a nuance here where you have four different um, like variations of VMBO. It's not very important for you to actually know this, but it is kind of something good to know in form of like there is some variation in what kind of education you can get. And this is 4 years. And after that, you get something that's also a bit more applied level of education that you can get. Sometimes what you'll do is if you have a specific level of AMBO, you can go for HAVO, and then you can go get for HAVO, you can go to WVO. It depends on if your grades are good enough, if you have good enough motivation, all that kind of stuff. So most people who do VMBO actually go to their level of education, which is then called MBO. These people start when they're 16 years old, so it's also when they are roughly younger. I think the interesting part here specifically about um, the Netherlands here is that this is quite early. So we select roughly what education you're going to get, which is going to dictate the rest of your life, dependent on 12 years old. So this is a young age. And this is dependent on partially what does your teacher from primary school think that you're able to get. So I think the teacher can always actually bump you up, even if your test results aren't that great. And then also there's a national test that you have that gives you an indication for this. And if you do well enough, you can basically get this level. If you do middle enough, you get this level. And if you don't do well, you get this level. These are also different forms of education. This one is, of course, more focused on people who are going to be more academic. So the classes are also catered more differently. The kind of things that are covered are slightly different. Same thing for HAVO. It's a bit more practical, a bit more applied, a bit less academic. And VMBO is even more applied and that kind of stuff. So that is the Dutch education system. Do people have any questions about this part? So maybe also good then to characterize, the Netherlands is a very highly educated population. So this also we have a very highly educated workforce. This means that overall the kind of narratives that we have in society is that you need to work up. So people who are doing, this level are going to be very smart, they're going to make a lot of money, that's good. So this is why people who even when they get HAVO kind of want to go to VWO. So they want to get to higher education. And there are a lot of people who are VMBO who actually feel like they are looked down upon. So they're not as seen as smart, they're not seen as independent. They're also again they're younger and also younger when they're going to go to their even higher level of education. They start that when they're 16. So they're seen as less responsible. They used to also not be called students, which meant they didn't get any benefits that students got. So students got benefits such as cheaper travel for like public transport, so trains and bus and that kind of stuff. MBO students for a long time didn't get that because they were not seen as students, but they're still seen as pupils because they technically were, oftentimes younger than 18 years old. Now there's been a lot of changes where they are now students, which means that they get the same benefits. So they get the same things like having like cheaper public transport and that kind of stuff. This is also maybe explaining why there's a shortage. So we also have a shortage actually of people who are more technical, more applied. So this can be something as like small as people who lay streets or people who like um, put the bricks on top of each other to make a wall. All of these things are things that are not necessarily we have a shortage of. Partially is because there lack of lack of people who actually want to do this education, want to do these jobs, and they feel there's pressure to get like stream up. I think it's also in the same time shows a bit of flexibility. So yes, you do decide at 12 years old what level of education you have, but you can also go up, right? If you do well enough here within the 4 years, you can go to the high level. You can go to the high level, so you can go to university in the end if you're putting in the effort, if you are smart enough to get that. I think this mostly explains things about the Dutch educational system. Again, I don't see any questions, so I'm just going to assume that this is clear. Maybe then also say something about Dutch universities.
No,
Dutch
I have a
universities,
question.
yeah, go for it.
How does the situation with migrants interact with this issue? Do you think it's helping with the shortage of easy jobs or no?
So yes and no. So sometimes the kind of jobs that you have are hard labor. So these are things, like I said, with maybe in construction and that kind of stuff. And what the Netherlands did and still does is we import people from different nations. So it used to be Poland for a long time, and then also now it is people from Turkey and people from Morocco, maybe people from Greece, and they come then here and then they work in the construction sites and they take over those jobs. So in that sense, migration is solving that kind of issue. But also there's a question, of course, of the kind of education that you want them to have. So the education specifically for people to lay down bricks, that is something that still has a lack of people sometimes, so that they're not able to actually get enough people to sign up for there to be an actual course that goes on. Like this is something that the study then can't happen for that year because not enough signups. So I assume it's like, yes, you have people who are willing to do hard works, but it's also a question of what credentials they have and the specific shortages that you have that might not be resolved by importing people from different nations who might not have the specific kind of credentials that you want or you credit within your country as well. Maybe another thing to know about Dutch universities specifically. Dutch universities are quite high quality. You pay as a member of like the EU roughly 2,500 euros per year to enroll. If you are a Dutch citizen, you also actually get direct benefits from the government. So you get, I think, roughly something like 500 euros if you are living not with your parents, you're living with, yourself in like student accommodation and that kind of stuff. And then you can also get a loan that you have from the government, which has a relatively cheap interest rate. So you can loan extra if you can't afford a job and you kind of like need to go through, and then you have to pay back. So you have to pay back um, what's it called? You have to pay back the loan with the interest rates, and you do not have to pay back the money that they give you directly if you finish your studies. If you do not finish your studies within a certain amount of years, then it gets translated to debt. And that's also actually the same with the benefits that you get from cheaper or free access to train transports and like public transport. That also it becomes a debt that you need to pay if you do not finish your studies. So it's one of those things where we are supporting you as the Netherlands, as the Dutch government, for you to do your studies, but we are also incentivizing you for to actually finish and to pick something right. Otherwise, yeah, you'll be paying for the fact that the Dutch government has been subsidizing your wrong choice. So that is something that's important to know financially. But also the university in the Netherlands are pretty good. So even though education in Germany is free for the universities, for at least German citizens, a lot of them still go to the Netherlands because the universities are high quality. We have specifically like we did a lot of investment in it. We have specific unique fields that we have in. So we have the strongest magnet that we do for physics research in Nijmegen, which is in the city that I'm from. This is very useful for research, so that draws a lot of people. We also have specific fields of subfields. So studies in Asia is one something that's unique in the Netherlands that we also spearheaded it. So there's a lot of rep that we have, but it's also something that's somewhat slowing down because the governments have been continuously cutting funds towards education over the last coalitions, which means that universities had to cut funding for research, had to cut funding for professors, had to merge different groups, and had to change a lot. So it's one of those things where The Dutch education system is good, especially the university one, but it's also going through a lot of changes due to the changing financial status, and therefore it should be good to actually still invest more in it so you don't fall back on the status that you have. Okay, that was the Dutch education system. Someone had questions about that. I hope that is explained. There's links to a question that the person also had, which is, do you have a brain drain problem? And I think not necessarily. I think the reason is that a lot of people want to stay in the Netherlands when it comes to people working here. I think things are quite well organized. We have a stable government. We have a good economy. Yes, housing is expensive, and there might be a reason for people to look somewhere else. But housing is especially expensive in places in the Randstad, as I said, and outside the area, it is cheaper. So people are also looking for places there. There are often still some alternatives that people go for. Um, it's always a bit of an interesting question on what international students should do. So sometimes international students go back to their home country, and then the question is, well, we invested in the education. They're not really giving us the benefits back. On the other hand, also, if they would stay, the question is, well, they would be taking a job from a Dutch person. So it's always an interesting perspective in immigration, what you want them to do. I don't have any specific numbers of like how much retention rate we have of international students. I couldn't find that online. Um, but I do not think that this is a big enough issue that it has been politically discussed within the Netherlands. I do know that. So I think that also should tell you that most likely in debates, you shouldn't really focus or discuss this much unless there's a motion specifically about Dutch immigration. Then you have to talk about this because it does affect also the economy because we are, like I said, a very highly intelligent and highly educated workforce. So we also do have our competitive edge there, which means it will be good if you have people from outside coming in to actually fill that market, that you have more competitive laborers and that kind of stuff. Other things is how is
Can,
the housing
can I
situation?
ask?
Oh yeah, go for it.
Yeah, but isn't it true that the far right is rising in the Netherlands as well because in migrants are stealing white collar jobs as well, or not?
So this is true in abstract. But the thing here is the specifics of Dutch politics. So the party that became really, really big with this was the PVV. Was very anti-immigration. Geert Wilders. If you know a bit about Dutch politics and populism, you know that guy. Um, it has been true that the PVV has been big, but it has been big for a long time. So they have been the biggest party in many occasions, but have been oftentimes ignored in coalitions because people just don't want to work with a quite extreme party, an internally inconsistent party, because they are very like right-leaning and conservative on immigration. Also want to have low taxes, but then also want to spend a shit ton of money on like education and healthcare and make that free and that kind of stuff. So it's kind of a generic populist agenda to just give everything to people and also stop the immigrants, which means that right-wing parties who might be more immigration skeptic kind of don't want to work with someone who's practically just a left-leaning party, which also is very dictatorial, very unpredictable. And in the coalition that happened in 2008, where you had them supporting a minority cabinet, they basically dipped out. So the PVV dipped out when there was basically going to have to be changes in the budget because we had a housing bubble that happened and then we had a credit crisis in the EU. And then the PVV was like, I'm not going to support these changes. And then basically fell, which also meant that a lot of parties kind of like felt hurt by that. So what happened then is the PVV is big, but it also hasn't been able to get much in power, and immigration has been a big issue, but it hasn't been in uh, uh, in politics now specifically because of that coalition falling, but also the previous coalition falling. So again, we had a coalition with a new social contract, the Farmers Party, the VVD, and then also the PVV, which is a quite right-leaning coalition. And that coalition also fell because, again, Geert Wilders makes a lot of promises on immigration, which says, oh, we're going to stop them and we're going to try to implement these plans. And then they tried to implement a plan that was so stupid and was so against any like law that we had that he had hoped that this would mean that other parties would step down because it'd be like, you can't do this law. But then the other parties called Geert Wilders bluff and were like, no, actually, we're not going to listen to you. We're not going to take the bait. We'll actually support you. Whatever it is, we'll support this policy. We'll actually make sure it happens, that kind of stuff. And actually, Wils had to take the fall and make this fall down. As a consequence, the PVV has gone down in voters a lot in the last election cycle. Partially because people might be pissed off because they're like, the PVV is not upholding the promises they're able to do. They finally had the power, they're able to do that. But also, they were able to sell it to the population in the form of the other parties were not allowing us to do the policies that we needed. But this then also led to a bit of defeatism within that population, which meant that people felt like, well, even if we want him to vote for him, it doesn't matter because it's just a waste of votes because he can never put the policies that we want anyways. So these are things that are stopping the PVV from becoming big. So immigration is a big issue, but oftentimes it's more of the more foreign and the more exotic kind. So these are people like also refugees, asylum seekers from oftentimes also Africa, and that's where oftentimes you have a lot of like politics because there's also asylum seeker centers that need to be placed in the Netherlands, and then there's a lot of backlash when they need to be placed because then there is a law that says we are forced to place them and spread them around. Local municipalities do not want to do this, so they backlash, and this can lead to violent protests. So this can lead to protest where you actually burn trash in front of the asylum seeker center that's being built. This looks like throwing rocks and stones at these places and that kind of stuff, which also worsens these problems. And also means that you get an issue of getting a lot of temporary asylum seekers places. And the issue of that is you're unable to construct these long term because they're not able to stay because you don't have the backing for it. But if you do them temporarily, the issue is either they're very poorly built and then you get very bad human rights conditions. So you get moldy places, lack of privacy, no real good like infrastructure in form of like plumbing and that kind of stuff. Or you get that you have to put them on boats and in hotels because of the law that you have to take care of them. Which means they either get really good but really expensive or really cheap and really shitty situations. And that's kind of like the duality of asylum seekers right now. Um, so this is a thing that is currently happening, and that's the discussion. It is more specifically on these asylum seekers and not as much on highly educated immigrants, because that's not what the most attention is about. Because it's not about like students that are here and where they're coming or not. The another thing to note is that the PVV was the biggest opposition party after the last coalition, because again, it didn't get enough votes. It didn't get enough votes to become part of the coalition or basically to be unable to be ignored, which meant that the PVV lost votes. And then they were, for a while, the largest opposition party. But then there was also a split in the party where party members were basically annoyed at the dictatorial structure of the PVV, said, finally, we have enough, and split off, which means the PVV is now, I think, the second largest opposition party after the Labour Party, the left-wing party, that is now quite big. So this is the Labour Green Left Party, the Progressief Nederland, Progressive Netherlands is the new name, and that kind of stuff. So this is maybe just a bit of a crash course on Dutch immigration politics. So is it on the rise? Kind of yes and no. It's still something that people vote for. But if you also look at this coalition, all of the parties said we're going to be hard on getting policies done, but they also are not really focusing on it in discussions. So it's to say, yeah, we're going to have hard migration policies, but they don't have anything specifically that they're platforming now, and that kind of stuff. And part of this just has to do with our own human rights laws, which means that you can only just take in asylums in a very specific way, and you can put them in very shitty situations, or the fact that you just have EU regulations and EU laws, or the fact that we also are part of the EU. So if you just kick out immigrants, then and you kick them out to Germany, then they might still stay with the EU. And there's just a question of how are you really going to get rid of the people that you want to kick out? Are you going to try to maybe put all of those things outside of the EU so you have more of those places outside of the EU that you can process people and then they come inside the EU and that would solve the immigration issue. But that is more speculative, and that is kind of the solutions that you would want to have that's more EU focused, so something that the national parties can't really promise to do. So that is a large explanation of immigration politics in the Netherlands. Does this answer your question, or does this bring up more questions?
Yeah, completely. Thank you.
Okay, good. Then let's see. The other thing that was a question was, how's the housing situation? I already kind of covered that. It's like a housing shortage. The housing market in the Netherlands is quite complex. I talked about a couple of what's it called? Like a couple of factors in like the workshop that I uploaded yesterday. You could go into detail about that there, but I also think if you really want to have a good grasp of it, I recommend looking it up yourself because the Netherlands is just quite complicated to get a good grip on what the specific housing issue is because it is just multifaceted. We have a lot of regulations and a lot of like requirements such as building social housing, a certain percentage of your building projects. We have regulations for how much money you can ask and that kind of stuff, which means that when it comes to solving and like deregulating the housing market, there are always questions of how many more houses can you build and will you build? What quality will they be? What term will they be? And also, are we able to do it anyway, given that we have a nitrogen crisis, which meant that we are not allowed to create new projects or give new approval of projects if this leads to more nitrogen going into the air. So that is the housing crisis, elderly care, children, mother support. I also in the video have a bit of an explanation of the welfare state. Overall, it is relatively strong. It doesn't cover everything. The Netherlands is a bit of a thing where it is we're not always going to give things for free. It tends to be conditional. It tends to be not enough to cover everything, and that kind of stuff. So elderly care, the elders are actually the richest population in the Netherlands, but there also are people who are quite poor, quite lonely. We have privatized a lot of the elderly care market, which means that as a consequence, a lot of the elderly care facilities are now focused more on pumping out results rather than actually spending time with the people who are there. The question is then, would this have been much better in their nationalized system? Depending on also how much funding you would give the nationalized system, how much funding would that system get? So I think there's interesting questions that you can have about what would happen if the Dutch healthcare system would become nationalized. I do not expect a motion to come up about this, and I also do not expect this motion to come up about because of all the complex layers that happen within the healthcare system. Because some products are free, like you can always go to the physician for free, there's no issue there. But then some things like doing specific tests, like taking an X-ray picture, is something you have to pay out of pocket first. But then if you reach a certain limit and you spend a certain amount of money on healthcare, then it should be cut from insurance. But that depends on what insurance you've gotten, and every insurance company has to accept you in the first place. And then the question is, how much money are you paying that insurance company as a consequence of you maybe having a more expensive, like, what's it called? Having more expensive things, like more things covered within your insurance, as well as maybe having your deductible or like how much you need to pay upfront by yourself. Like all of these things are variants. There's competition, there's state regulations that's very tight, there's state subsidies and all this stuff, which in the end means you get a very complicated system to understand. Where again, pre-COVID in the Netherlands, we had motions in Dutch about Dutch politics, and we had motions about it then. But even then, for me, it was I learned something new every debate about the Dutch healthcare system because it is just quite unclear what things are included, what are not, and how it all exactly works, and how the free market interacts with the state. Then the question is, what are the biggest income slash industries of the Netherlands? I also in the video have a section about the economy. And what we'll show you there is that the largest part of the income that we have is actually from services, which is roughly 70 to 80%. And then the other part is actually exports, which is roughly, I think, 15 to 20%. And then there's like 2% of agriculture. This might be weird if you heard the fact that the Netherlands is the largest exporter of agriculture, but it's just that we re-export a lot of agriculture. I go already in a bit more depth about the exports of the things what they actually make, so the industry part. So I'm not going to go into depth here. What I'm going to talk a bit more about is the sector industry, because there's also a question more specifically about that. This is in Dutch, so I don't expect you to know this. So I'm going to explain it to you. Here on the x-axis, you have percentage of the sector industry. I am going to immediately say this is from 2018, and that is because we have the Central Bureau of Statistics, which publish a lot of data, which is very nice, but also is a minefield in finding the research that you want for the data that you want. It sometimes takes a very long time. So I was unable to find this specific information about the sector from a more recent time. But this is still largely accurate. This hasn't changed much since then, because I have looked also at more of the specifics of the number that comes from the report and the other reports that we got from currently. So maybe some slight changes, but they're not much. So this is just trade and helping trade. So in the Netherlands, we have, again, I'm going to now copy the map again that we had. We have a lot of trade, and we're very trade oriented and also internationally oriented country. And part of it has to do with the map of the Netherlands. I'm going to go here. There are a couple of areas that are important to know. Of course, we have Rotterdam, which is a very large port. It used to be the largest port in the world for a long time. It isn't anymore. We have here is actually Antwerp. but also we allow trade between this, which is part of the Netherlands, but we also, of course, sell services that's related to this. We also, of course, have this, which is called, I think the Waal still when it's going to go actually called the Rhine. The Waal is actually when it comes here to Nijmegen, which is where I live, which is why I'm confused. This is called the Rhine, and here you of course have the Ruhr area. So here you have very big production in Germany. So these are like where your car industry is. We have a lot of like industries being created. So we transport that stuff, of course, over the rivers. So we also, of course, help with the transport there. And this can be, of course, transporting goods ourselves, selling stuff to the boats that are going along the way, and that kind of stuff. Amsterdam for a long time also used to be a big port. It actually wasn't. It's been for a bit, and that's just because the canals that are in Amsterdam are too small for the current larger trading boats that we have to be important. Other things that we have is that we also have some ports here, which aren't maybe as big, but you also see we have quite some rivers. So we also do have some trade that's happening from that way. So this is why the first thing that you see here is just trade and helping with trade. This is why the Netherlands also is overall very benefited by the EU. And this gets to a question that we get later on, which is about like what does the Dutch stance about the EU? If you are a normal right-wing party, you like the EU because all of this trade becomes easier. You can make more profit and stonks go up because you just are able to supply more for your services. Other things here are holdings. It seems very vague and abstract, but this can be a lot of things. So this can be, for example, patents, helping with patents. This can also be verification and putting standards. So we have, for example, the largest company which verifies and certifies boats, certifies wires, all of that kind of stuff, and it's actually placed in Arnhem. Fun fact. And that is also a big sector. So there's also a service industry. So there's also quite technical, like you need to know about the law, but you also need to know about design and all of this kind of stuff, which also explains to you why we have such a big thing that is about highly educated people and why we invest so much in the university, because it's important for the biggest sector, which is our service sector, which part of it is the things that we're going to talk about now. The other thing here is about like information technology. So this can be IT, helping with IT, all of that kind of stuff. The other thing, and this has been increasing since 2018, this is here, which is, how do you say this? Helping with transport and having more places that you can keep storage. So what you have to think is Germany, for example, imports stuff from Amazon or Temu or whatever international company. At some point, they need to store, first the packages need to all go to, for example, Rotterdam. They come in there. And then what you can do is you can go from Rotterdam to, for example, storage place here in Germany. But what has been recently growing is just having more storage places in the Netherlands. This has both its positive and negative effects. The positive effect is it creates jobs. The question is, for who does it create jobs? And oftentimes, what are the working conditions under them? Because oftentimes these are immigrants and they're oftentimes very bad working conditions. Also very, well, sometimes like inconsistent as well in the kind of work they could do. So they oftentimes also don't pay a lot of like taxes. They do take quite some land because these are oftentimes very big spaces. The question is, do you want to build them somewhere else? And also there are oftentimes benefits that they get from actually going here. So they try to just go to a local municipality and they start scamming. They go like, oh, look, we are a company. Look, we were going to build this place where we're going to keep all the packages. And for you, the municipality, just trust us, guys. This is the municipality. Very nice building. It says, look, we're going to give you so much money and we're going to give you so much jobs. Sometimes there might be also some like pernicious stuff where they maybe write regulations, they fund think tanks to then get policies implemented by the Dutch national government or municipal government. They might also promise direct money. It isn't like complete corruption. This isn't, still, we are not a very corrupt country, but it is the more perverse ways in which you can try to convince people to get this. And then the municipality says, oh my God, this is so good. We're going to get so much jobs. All this is great. They don't fact check. They don't oftentimes have as much information, how much jobs and money it just creates generally. And then they build this here. It leads to transport issues because guess what? If you have a lot of things come here, this might also clog your road system. It might also clog your things that you would also need to build, if this is built in the industry sector, so like an industrial area in your municipality, then this also comes at the cost of that. And also, they oftentimes want things uh, like low taxes, that kind of stuff. So those kind of things happen. The current biggest party, D66, had a part of their campaign being also about there are many things in the economy that you can kind of like let loose, and then you just get negative effects. So things like this, where you just maybe have a lot of construction, where a lot of the places here aren't actually for Dutch consumers, they're for international consumers, and the amount of jobs that you get aren't actually great, and they aren't in great conditions. So what we should do is we should have the state come in and should guide the economy. So they want to be maybe a bit more strict about what kind of things are allowed here, how many are going to allow them. Are we going to put regulations on what these boxes look like? Must maybe be combined with solar panel farms? Must it be able to do anything else? Do we going to put like limits or quotas on that? And it's not going to do a very strict, like left-leaning, more authoritarian grip on the market. But the way that we do it in the Netherlands is just we have regulations and we give hints and we have requirements, and that's the way that we do it. But we still like the idea of like a free market. So this is the way this is happening. This is something that has been growing. So I think currently this is about 5%. I think that must have been growing to roughly like at least 8 to 10%, somewhere around here. Then anything else is just also transport by land. This is architect companies, so people that build stuff. And this is again also all the stuff that actually makes a profit, right? So this is something that makes us money as things we sell. This isn't like also services like education, healthcare, all of that kind of stuff. That's also a big part of the sector. Again, if it is roughly 70%, that the total 70 to 75% that the service sector is for the Dutch economic activity, then roughly 50 something percent is what we have for commercial, and the other 15% is what we have for more like state things. So these are like such healthcare, education, for like our own consumption that doesn't necessarily create direct value for the the stockholders, if you want to look at it that way. So this is about the service sector. Again, I have another video that goes into more depth about the export sector. I'm not going to do it here because otherwise this Q&A session will be very long. Is there a question about the service sector or anything that I've just talked about? I assume not. So we can go again to a clean sheet. This can be going. This can be going. Tourism. As you can see, tourism isn't very, very important to the Netherlands. It is very big in Amsterdam, of course. We have a lot of people going there, a lot of tourists going there. I don't know how much of the GDP actually is tourism. I assume it's part of the service sector, right? It's your restaurants, it's like your maybe also a bit like your shops that are selling souvenirs. It is not as dependent on it. Like if Amsterdam would suddenly not become as popular, it might hurt the specific Amsterdam economy that's around tourism, but it wouldn't hurt the GDP of the national government as much. Again, also you could argue it would actually be good for Amsterdam because there are a lot of tourists there, a lot of trash. Maybe other things are actually being crowded out as a consequence of that. Things become more expensive, housing becomes more expensive. So maybe less tourism would be good for Amsterdam, but it isn't something that's very important to the Dutch national GDP. Other questions that we have are the biggest fear of the Netherlands and why do we maybe go abroad or go to a new city. I think the Netherlands, if you look at what people vote and care about, it is immigration. And I think I already went into an explanation about that, how it works, especially for asylum seeker centers. Another thing is just the housing crisis and the cost of living going up. Things are becoming more expensive. Supermarkets are more expensive. Housing is very expensive. People are now living with their parents, because they just can't find a house and it's just too expensive. And I do also experience this myself. It is just very hard to find a house. A lot of people respond and that kind of stuff. One of the issues is, of course, the nitrogen crisis, which means that we can continue constructing what we've already allowed. Like you can't just rescind all of those things that the government said were okay to go, but we can start new ones, and we can't build, for example, new houses as a consequence of that. So the original government, like the D66 campaign, was also we're going to build 10 cities. They didn't say this during the campaigning, but afterwards they said this was metaphorical. We're not going to actually build 10 cities. And the reason for this is that that's already quite dense. So there aren't that many places where you could actually build 10 full cities. Maybe it would be in specific places where you would have low density people. So again, everyone wants to go to the Radstad. So places outside have a lot of elderly people, especially in the north. There's a lot of elderly people, but there aren't that many young people sticking around there. So you could maybe expand places there, but you can't just build new places because every part of the Netherlands has either been assigned as a nature area and nature reserve, which means that it's protected and you can't, as the Dutch government, very easily construct it there, or it is on farmland, and then we need to buy out a lot of farmers. And of course, then you also need to change the infrastructure, right? You need to build loans, like so build roads, create a plumbing system, make it part of the energy network, and that kind of stuff. So it would be quite expensive thing to do. Expanding into cities and just building a lot of houses will be possible in maybe these places that are like small villages or towns or things that are already cities. But it isn't something that's very easily done, especially with the nitrogen crisis, especially with how dense the Netherlands is. And also just the question of how are you going to exactly do the sort of practical parts. And then the question, of course, what is the like influencing their moods and beliefs? Like, what's the important way to characterize the average person? Again, like the immigration, housing, cost of living. Other things might also be regulations. So the Netherlands has a lot of regulations. And if I talk to anyone at work who is oftentimes more right-leaning than me, and definitely more right-leaning than the average debater, they just bitch about how much regulation the Netherlands has, which means that you have, for example, very low rent yields. So it is not possible for someone to buy a second house and then rent it out to another person oftentimes because it is just very like there are a lot of requirements for it, a lot of regulations and rules. Also for oftentimes companies, if they want to construct things, you have to do a lot of research beforehand. You need to look into the ground, you need to see if there isn't a protected bird species that's living or breathing in that space as well, and that kind of stuff. Which means that uh, people want to stop that regulation. But then it's also one of those questions of the regulations are also there for a reason. So the VVD has been in power for a very long time. That is a very big right-wing party, and they've always said we're going to cut down on unnecessary regulations. In every plan that they had campaign-wise, it was we're going to cut down on regulations. They have been barely able to cut down in regulations. And the reason is that these are oftentimes for a good reason. So these are, you don't want the projects to start being shady in the first place. You don't want them to be financially irresponsible. You want to protect the nature. You need to make sure that the areas around it are respected and that kind of stuff. There have been some, oh, sorry. There's been some changes. So there have been changes in to what extent the surrounding people in a project can actually veto something happening. That is what changes happened in the last government that they tried to push. There have been some changes, maybe allowing some easier regulations, but it's a bit hard to know what to cut down because it is just there oftentimes for a good reason and for the benefit of the people. And also, you don't want this to become like Belgium, which is the other example. If you ever go to Belgium, you know that the roads are absolute shit. Like you can feel the difference of the roads when you go from Dutch to Belgium, because it just goes very down in quality. If you look at the cities, their cities are also oftentimes uglier because there aren't as many restrictions on where you can build and how, which means it's oftentimes like a very big mismatch of like different kind of buildings and that kind of stuff. They still have a housing crisis. They also still have their own issues. But as a result, things aren't as streamlined as well. So the way that the roads are built are like they're fine. Like it's not like a shithole, but it's not as effective as the Netherlands does this. Same with like parking spaces, how that's been assigned, public transport, the way that everything has just been created, because they had way more deregulation in Belgium in the first place, and therefore they just allowed more of this construction, especially after the Second World War. So as a consequence, it is do you want to become more like Belgium? I personally think no, for the various reasons that I said. But also, I think if you have the time to go to Belgium, just go to a city that you'll see the kind of ugly city that oftentimes exists in there, especially compared to the Netherlands. Again, might be a bit of my nationalism speaking through. but that is a genuine question that you have to ask yourself. Then a question about sports. Very fun. So we have winter sports that are big, which are oftentimes ice skating and nothing else because we don't have any hills. We are very, very flat. However, due to climate change, it's been harder to actually do any natural ice skating. You used to be able to do this in lakes, even like historically, so more than 100 years ago, you were able to do it on the rivers. Like the rivers froze over and you were able to skate from one side to the other. That has been possible for a long time. But also even just like small lakes, small ponds, all these things don't freeze over anymore. So we now have more artificial ice skating rinks and that kind of stuff. And then when it comes to more summer activities, we are quite big on football. We care about our Dutch national team a lot, and also actually about hockey. So this is also something we're actually quite good in. Competitively, we sometimes win the European Championship of hockey, both the men and women. It's something that gets a lot of attention also within the Netherlands. And another thing that we do enjoy is more casual. We don't have that many great players, but that's tennis. I think those are kind of the big three sports that you have when it comes to.
Hi, we lost you.
Yeah. Okay. When did you lose me?
In the past 40 to 30 seconds, maybe.
So what did you hear the last thing? Did I start talking about sports already?
Thanks was what you
Yeah,
were
yeah,
saying.
yeah.
What was I saying? Sorry, you fell off me.
Artificial ice rinks or whatever.
Yeah, artificial ice rinks. That is for it for winter sports. Again, we don't have that much snow anymore in the winter, which is quite sad. I used to be able to build snowmen and like snow fortresses and have snow fights, and that is just not the case anymore. In the good old days, I'm getting old. But also in the summer activities, we have, I think, three main sports. One of them is football. Most of the people who do sports, especially when they're young, do football. This is just a very common sport. We really care about our national team. We are quite good. Like we go for maybe to use debate, there was the out round of like World Cup and the European Cup. We often have very high expectations of our teams, and whenever we lose, it's always just us bitching and moaning about it, which in a way is also a bit a characteristic of Dutch culture. At least that's what I hear people say, is that we also complain a lot. Like we bitch and moan a lot about things going wrong and not going away, and things need to change and things not being perfect. But then again, if you also then look at the Netherlands and how we've organized things like our bike infrastructure, the way that we put our traffic system up, everything else, like we're quite fine. But we still want to kind of like complain a lot. So we also did a lot with our national team. So they didn't win from Morocco. We were very upset because we played very defensively. And one of the things like, oh, you don't like seeing them play defensively. You want to see them attack. So then when this goes wrong and the tactic doesn't work, then you're basically screwed because then everyone just going to screw you over. But if you play effectively, like defensively, and you would have won, then people would have called you a genius and they would have been happy that we won. Maybe still complaining and bitching about like the playing style, but there would be much less of it. That is about football. Other sports that are big is hockey, and I specifically mean field hockey. So this is outside hockey that you can play during the summer. We're quite good at this. We win like European finals for both the men and the women. We have very competitive teams also in like the team competitions and the European team competitions. So this is also quite big. This is more of a, how do you say it? It's like a rich people or upper layer kind of sport or activity. So there's oftentimes a stereotype of who goes there. The women are called like Anne Fleur. It's kind of like if they have two names, then they sound oftentimes a bit more fancy and rich, and then they are more likely to play things like hockey instead of football because football is a commoner sport. And if it's uh, like a guy, it's also like two names. It's something like Jan Kees or something like that. Also two names together, and that's also then someone more rich. The other sport that's also quite big is tennis. This is just more activity-wise. So what do people play rather than actually in our national teams because we don't have that many great national tennis players. So we play this more casually. And I think a good way to understand sports is you're kind of raised with the idea that you need to pick a sports. Most people, this just means that from an early age on, you do football. Then for some reason, if you do not like football or your family was raised doing else, then you might play, for example, volleyball, or you might play hockey, or you do that. And then oftentimes what you do as well is you have once or you start doing two sports when you are in primary school. So I did, for example, football for a long time as well as tennis. Then at some point I didn't like football anymore, so I went to volleyball. And then for a long time during high school as well, I also did volleyball and I did tennis as well. And this is kind of a norm and something that does just happen more often, that you do a lot of sports, and it is very encouraged. Um, the state also does subsidize this. There are also charities and projects to make this accessible for people who have a lower income. Um, and this is just a big thing also in our culture. This was a question someone had about how sports work. I think this is just roughly how sports work. I'm not going to go into the Dutch leagues, especially the football league, because then I would be here for another hour talking to you about this, and I don't think that people would want that. Unless
Uh,
Barnabas, you disagree or you have other questions.
no, I just wanted to highlight how road cycling I know is also big in the Netherlands. I mean, it's for sure.
Yeah, it is, but road cycling to us is not a sport. It's just a mode of transport. So you bike towards work, for example, or you bike towards school, but that does not count as like a sport activity that you do. Like if you ask someone, what do you do for sports? And they bike every day to school, but they don't do anything else, they say, I don't play any sports. Um, if you think about like actual people who do like, the really quick ones where they have like a helmet on and they go very, very fast. That's also big. It's becoming bigger over the last years. It wasn't as big before. And that's mainly because it's been more normalized. The bikes have become cheaper. There has been more like sport clubs that are also, organizing this, that have popped up, that become profitable. So that has also become bigger. But the biking stuff is also just something that just keeps us active and healthy and that kind of stuff. Sorry, Barnabas, did you want to add anything or
No, no, no. I mean, I have different questions unrelated to sports specifically.
okay, then I'll just quickly go through the last one that is on the form, if I'm correct. Uh, so there have been three more questions. One about them is ASML. I've already talked about ASML in the video that I did yesterday, so I'm not going to talk about that, especially because this workshop is already getting to an hour. There have been a question about significant minorities. Like I said, there are significant Eastern European minorities and there are significant North African minorities. Eastern European, especially Polish, and now of course also Ukrainian, because we have a lot of refugees, is specifically Polish because we used to import them for work that we didn't want to do. People just felt that they didn't want to do construction work. It was not paid well enough. It was too live physical, and it was not the kind of like Dutch dream to work on it. It was just get high education and get a fancy job at like a big law firm and that kind of stuff. So then we had a lot of like Polish workers. Later on, Polish workers kind of became too expensive. Then we got more Turkish workers and we got more Moroccan workers, and then we did the same thing. The reasons why the minorities are significant is because in the past, around the 60s, the VVD, so again, the right-wing party, basically created policy, or at least the right, I don't know if it's specifically the VVD, but the right created policy where you allow people to come and allow their families to come as well, but you do not force them to assimilate, which meant that you got a lot of big groups within cities that did not speak the language, did not assimilate, and never had to in the first place. So this just led to quite big of these minorities. There have been more integration that's been forced on immigrants or required. There's also been more help. We have been experimenting with different things as well, such as allowing people who are now asylum seekers and are waiting for their documentation to be, approved, which can take a very long time in the Netherlands because we don't give enough funding towards this infrastructure of this. Um, because of the fact that like you have to wait for a long time. We are now experimenting with, in specific cases, allowing them to already start working, which have positive results because a lot of them do want to work and they're very eager to work and they don't actually fall sick very, very often. But also doesn't mean that you integrate them already more. And if they then get a no, there's a question of whether this is fair or not and what this actually would do within the system. But of course, overall, this is good because if you do not give them anything to do, they're just wandering around. Then you get people calling them like just people who are wandering around, who are not doing anything, who are just on the streets, making it unsafe and that kind of stuff. So that is also like a bit of a question that we have. Significant minorities as well, like I said, Islam. You have a lot of Moroccan and Turkish people and communities. That's also why whenever Morocco wins in the World Cup, there's a lot of noise and people like honking the cars and fireworks and that kind of stuff. Because they're a big group of people who have a Moroccan background who celebrate these things. Um, so ASML and then Dutch EU politics. Like I said, the Netherlands is very internationally based and very open because we need that because we're a big transport country and big export country. We are one of the largest exports of agriculture, not because we produce so much agriculture, but rather because we buy up and transport a lot of the agriculture and export it further for higher prices. So we like the EU. We like the idea of free trade. We like the idea of having good regulations, giving like clarity and transparency and stability, and that's all good. However, the Netherlands has always characterized itself as fiscally responsible, which means that we do not want to spend too much money and we do not want to have our debt to become very, very big. So this doesn't mean that we don't have any government debt or that our budgets are very, very tight and always are like zero, so the same income as the things that the government spends. But it does mean that it's something that we pride ourselves on. So in the international relations with the EU, we also expect other nations to do this. So we disagree if Italy or Greece or Spain does not do this and is fiscally irresponsible. And therefore, we're kind of like very upset if they're not upholding these standards. These are standards of how big can your annual debt be and how much can it grow and how much is your total debt uh, compared to your GDP. So we're kind of like pains in the ass about that, especially internationally. And then the other thing as well is we are quite against the creation of Eurobonds. So I don't know if you know what Eurobonds are, but the idea is the EU wants to spend money. The way it kind of gets money now is partially by getting taxes that they ask within the EU, like from countries outside of the EU becoming part of projects such as the UK or Norway, but also from memberships and people paying, like the members paying for the projects. This can be, again, the project can be the Erasmus projects, arts projects, investment funds to create infrastructure in places. This can be things like the agricultural funds to make agricultural sectors more competitive. Those things are like the EU budget, the income flow and the outcome flows, or the spend flows, however you want to call it. And whenever there's a mismatch, the only way to solve this is if there's too much being spent, you either cut the spending or you ask for giving in more money. The Netherlands doesn't want to give more money because it's like, we just want to spend more. We don't want to spend as much. It doesn't necessarily benefit us directly. Yada, yada. We think people should just be more fiscally responsible. We should just cut the things that we're doing with the EU budget, and we should do less things, like maybe spending less on the agricultural funds and spend more on shared defense spending, something like that. But also, we're very much against the EU creating EU bonds. So the idea is this: you have the EU, they have a deficit. So what they do is what every government does, which is, oh, we need more money. We're instead of like just printing more money, what we're going to do is we're going to basically loan money on the international market, where we're going to create bonds where we say, look, we just need $100 billion. We're going to spread this out of bonds and we're going to tell everyone we're going to buy this back. The idea being the EU is very, very big. The EU is very much a lot of stable economies. So the interest rate on these would be very, very low, which means that it wouldn't cost the EU that much to borrow this money, which is a infinite free money glitch, as you could potentially say. However, the Netherlands is opposed to this for a couple of reasons. One, they don't want countries to become fiscally irresponsible. So what they would say is, but what if the Greeks start spending again very, very recklessly in their economy and start funding projects that are not going to be profitable? And we're just going to need to build them out continuously with these bonds. And then this becomes more expensive and that kind of stuff. But what we just want to do is to make Greece more financially responsible. The other thing that they don't want is they don't want their own government bonds to become less valuable. Again, they feel like, oh, the Netherlands, we are a stable country, a stable economy. We don't have that much debt for purpose. We try to be very fiscally responsible. So our government bonds are very, very like low interest rates. But if you have the EU bonds, it is likely that international investors want to buy the EU bonds instead of our bonds. So we don't want it either. So this is why countries like the Netherlands and also Germany are kind of like very mad and upset about creating these bonds, and they're not necessarily in favor of it. So this is very specific on the financial stuff. It is very, very unlikely for the Netherlands to actually exit the EU. Like it would be more disastrous than Brexit was, partially because we're so dependent on the international trade, as you saw from our surface sector, because of the fact that we have very big ports, because we have these rivers that are streaming through the Netherlands that we need for transport, but also because we are way more economically integrated. We share the same currency. Our national bank is also like just a subsidiary of the European Central Bank and doesn't have its own independence. So like any motion about like an exit is one of those things where it is very unlikely to happen for all of these interests, but also will be absolutely disastrous for the Dutch economy. That was a question about the Dutch EU politics. Another thing to maybe highlight, which I said as well, is I talked a bit about immigration, and immigration kind of needs to be solved internationally. Um, the current government, I don't know what the specific plans are for immigration. They've kind of like been putting that more on the back burner, focusing on other policies. I don't know to what extent they're able to actually push through the immigration policy that they want to get, that will get more asylum seeker, like asylum seeker centers outside of the EU and process them, and whether this will be good or not. Um, but I do think overall they are in favor of maybe creating these kinds of things. And again, the EU skepticism is specifically more within the PVV. That's just because the PVV wants to close the borders, and therefore you just need to get out of the EU because there's just so much regulation that stops it. But that also is why all the other parties that are in the Netherlands would never allow like an EU next to like happen because it would just be terrible for the economy. I saw some people trying to unmute in the meantime. Are there any questions either about this or any new questions that you have that popped up?
Yeah, about the EU bond, I get Greeks. I am Greek, I know. We have been not so good with our financial situation, I get that. But there is actually a law that says that you cannot surpass 3% deficit in all European countries.
Yeah.
So I don't get how much of debt Greeks can take anymore.
Yeah. So the question is like this is indeed for the national budget. I don't like look because again the current way the budget in the EU works is it needs to have the same income as the outcome. I don't think that specific regulation would actually apply for the EU budget. I might be wrong. Maybe the law says that in the same way, inevitably, if the EU tries to do this, it also applies to the EU funds. But this would mean that if it comes like the thing is also these bonds and the money is for EU projects. So it would not be Greece creating its own money and spending it. It would be the EU want to do investment funds in Greece, and that's what's asked for. And in that way, indeed, there's a question of to what extent this is happening. And also there's a problem where they feel like those rules might exist, but maybe nations will want to get rid of these rules in order to create more economic activity and get more growth and that kind of stuff. So even if it would apply for the EU budget now, they might want to cut it because, oh, we have such stable funds and we can get so much cheap money. It would be bad to not invest and take the money now to invest in our economy.
Yeah, and there is a lot of corruption in this country, so this project might take a longer time, more money. Yes, I get that. Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions about the Netherlands?
I have a question.
Yeah.
When there's a motion about, I don't know, Dutch politics, can you make the case that people are losing trust in the state because of, I don't know, the various coalition collapses and how difficult it's for them to form a coalition, and I don't know, like the childcare benefit scandal and stuff like this?
Yeah. So on the one hand, this is definitely true. People have been losing trust, especially because the last coalition has been very, very ineffective. And even in the current coalition talks, the VVD was, as some say, maybe tactical, others might say childish in not wanting to cooperate with the biggest party that would give them majority, which would be Labour, Green Left, which is now Progressive Netherlands. So there's a distrust there. But maybe a good thing to know is that if you look historically at the Netherlands, a lot of the coalitions fall apart. So in the early 2000s, you had the coalition fall apart. After Pim Fortuyn was assassinated and Lijst Pim Fortuyn became very, very big, we had the fall of that coalition. Then, of course, during the 2008, 2010 housing bubble crisis slash European Union credit crisis, we also had the falling of cabinet because, again, they had a minority cabinet with the PVV. Then afterwards, we also had cabinets fall over. We had a bit of time where we had like a couple of like stable governments with Mark Rutte as prime minister, but then also Mark Rutte made one coalition fall to basically make the next election about immigration to then make it better. Before that, in the 90s and 80s, we had coalitions fall apart. So it is kind of a Dutch tradition and also a certain like a Dutch amnesia. So you get a period where the coalitions go terrible, and we're like, oh, Dutch politics is terrible, and this and that. And this also means that oftentimes very extreme parties maybe don't get as much votes on. And then the parties who say, no, we need to go back to a stable government and just getting things done and just doing what is needed and taking responsibility. They become big, and then you have a couple of stable coalitions. Then for some reason, one of those coalitions falls, and then you have the same circus happening again, and people being like, oh, unprecedented time where coalitions are falling and the Dutch government is unstable and takes a long time to form a coalition, and this is really, really bad. And then it just goes on. So this is one of those things where history is never like repeating itself, but it definitely rhymes. And this also is the case for Dutch politics. Are there any other questions?
Do you think there's anything else that's relevant since the last coalition fell, or anything that we should know about the current coalition other than the governing parties or about the policies that they've done?
Um, I don't know. I think everything that is relevant has already been kind of covered by the videos that are online as well. So if I think about any extra information I would add there, like if you just want to have another more broad view about the economy, so more about the exports, more about the culture, a bit more about geography, a bit more about the politics, you can watch the video that I uploaded yesterday. The other thing that you could do as well is there's one that's just on basic Dutch politics, which gives you just an introduction on that, which should give you an understanding of just Dutch voting culture, how the actual parliament works for the first and second chamber, and that kind of stuff. And then if you want to indeed learn about the actual coalition, there is no way for you to really understand it without just doing, I think, just the proper groundwork, which is just watch the first three videos, which is everyone who's in the coalition. It will talk to you about what did they campaign on, what do they find important, and then also the largest opposition parties, which were the PVV and Progressive Netherlands, which used to be called Green Left and Labour. So what did they campaign on? Why did they lose? What is their issue in Dutch politics? If you want to debate the politics in an actual good sense. So that would be kind of like my recommendation. There isn't anything else that I feel like hasn't been covered by those videos that I can just give to you as information now. Because some of this just requires context. Like you need to know how the first and second chamber worked in the Netherlands in the first place to understand why coalition processes can be long. You need to understand where the CDA and VVD came from to understand why it is that they are willing to take a minority coalition now, instead of maybe having it full and just trying to get a majority next time. All of that just requires context, and all of that is what you get within those videos.
Yeah, thank you. I think I have a good base because I've seen like a good chunk of those videos.
Good, good, good. Any more questions or remarks? Okay, let's see. There isn't anything on the paint anymore. Well, I think I'll leave the session for this. I think this is everything that needs to be covered. If you still have any questions, technically you can still fill in the form, or you can just DM me and I can maybe answer it either in a voice note or in text. But like I said, I think all the information should be already online. There's quite a lot of extensive workshops on the Dutch Competitive Platform YouTube channel that will cover most of the grounds. Okay, good luck. So, and have fun with EUDC.